Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Andy Menon. This is part 4 of the Data Service API video series. In this video, we are going to be talking about the UiPath Data Service endpoints that allow you to perform file-based operations against your entity. Before we begin, I would recommend that you watch the first 3 parts of this video series. Otherwise, the demos shown here in this video will not make a lot of sense. With that, let's get started. So I am back in my data service instance in the automation cloud, and I have pulled up the list of fields for the user profile entity that was created as part of this video series. And one of the fields that I've added to this entity is the profile image file. And this column has the field type set to file. So what the file type field allows you to do is it allows you to store a file that is less than 10 megabytes in size against your entity record. So if and when you want to add a file type field to your entity, all you got to do is go in here and then create a new field, put in the display name and also a corresponding internal name, and then select the file type from the type dropdown. There is also an option to make this field required, but there's something that you have to observe here. If you select the file type from the dropdown, the option to make it required will no longer be available. So we'll come back to this later, but for now, let's just select the type file and then go down and click the more details option. And then you can provide a meaningful description here and also restrict the access to this field based on the role that you have assigned to this particular column. All you have to do is hit save and a file type field is added to your entity. Now, I'm not going to do it because I already have added a file type. So I'm going to hit cancel. But what I'll be doing is I'm going to be editing this field because I do not like the fact that the internal name and the display name are identical. So I'm going to go ahead and hit edit. And I'm going to put in some spaces here in the display name. Note that once you have already assigned an internal name, you cannot change it. The only way to change it is to delete this field entirely and add a new one. Now, we did look at the required option when creating a new file type just a few minutes ago. Now here's the problem. At the time when you selected file, the required option disappeared. But I see that when I bring up a file type column to be edited, that option is available to me. Now, if you want, you probably can make this required, but I'm not going to do that because it's not always necessary that every entity record is going to have a file associated with it. So I'm going to let this pass and I'm going to simply save my changes and exit the edit mode. So here now I have the display name that is different from the internal name. So that's pretty much what it takes for you to add or edit a file type column to your entity. Now, once you have already added the field, if you go back to the data, you will see a file type field appear here. And from the automation cloud interface, you can always upload a file. And once you have uploaded a file, you can also delete a file or you can download a file. But we are not going to do that from here because the entire purpose of this demo is to show you how to do it through the API endpoints. So I'm back in my Postman environment and I have a new request, a blank new request ready to go. And here I have the documentation of the upload file to entity endpoint. Usually, I have been always composing requests by starting with the URL. But what I'll be doing this time is I'm going to take a slightly different approach, and it will become clear as I start applying different components of this documentation to my request. So let's start with the request headers instead. And if we look at the request headers, as usual, the request headers requires the authorization, and that is the bearer token. But here you have the content type, and it says multi-part form data. Now, this is what is different. When you are using this with Postman, you will not be adding this header yourself, and I'm going to show you why. So let's start with the basics. I'm going to now go to the authorization part and compose the authorization. So we all know that this is going to be a post request. So put in post. And then the next thing that I want to be doing is authorization. Obviously, my token is saved in a variable named DS access token. So I'll be using that variable. And I'm going to set this to bearer token. And now my token variable has been automatically populated. So when we go to the headers, you can see that the authorization header has already been added, but it is usually the practice to add the content type here. But this is where things are a bit different. You're not going to add this, as I said, because in case of this request, everything that you read in the documentation doesn't translate one-on-one when forming the request. So let's come back to this later. The next thing that we want to be looking at is the request body, and the request body says file binary, but the request header also states that the content type must be multi-part form data, right? So what we do is we go to the body section and then we select form data. And then once you select form data, you select the key type. And this time, because your request body is going to be a file, you select file. And then here's another thing that you have to be careful about in Postman. You simply cannot select a file randomly on your computer. That is because by default, Postman will not allow you to select files outside of its environment. What do we mean by that? If we go to the settings tab and bring up the settings, scroll all the way down to working directory. This is where Postman looks for files. And if you want the Postman client to read files outside of this folder, you have to enable this slider. But I'm not going to be doing that. And remember, this is applicable only to the Postman desktop client. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I have put all my files at this location. So if I go into my folder structure, you can see that I'm at this location and in Postman files, and I have a couple of image files. Therefore, Postman can read the files at this location, so we are good there. And that is something that you have to know. So I'm going to X out and I'm going to select the file. In this case, I'm targeting a record that's named super top secret agent. So I'm going to copy this image and I'm going to give it a name, and it is file. So that's good. So from the documentation, we have the authorization. We know that the content type is form data. We have set that. And we also know that the request body must be of type file, which we have already done. Next, we'll go over to the params tab and submit the query parameters. Now, this request has got one query parameter. This is optional, but I'm going to put it in there because we know we have that option. And I'm going to put in expansion level 2. So we have all the components pretty much that are required to assemble this request. The next thing that we are going to be talking about is the URL. Now, this is where things are going to be slightly different. So we start with the base URL. The base URL translates as usual to what we have here. That is, it's not going to be much of a problem. So here you can see that the URL, the base URL translates to this line 11. That is applicable to my instance of data service in the automation cloud. What's different is the extension URL. Now, in case of the extension URL, the documentation states that it has to be of this format, which is good, which is straightforward, and we are, sort of kind of we assume that that's how it's supposed to be used. But in Postman, that is not the way it works. So under normal circumstances, you would translate that to something like this. Attachment, you have the entity, that's your user profile. You have the record ID, and that's the ID of the entity that you're actually uploading the file against. And then you have the field name, and the field name is the internal name of that field, the file type field in the data service instance. So if I go back to my user profile and look at the fields, I have the profile image file, which is the internal name of the file type field in the entity. So that is how it would normally translate to, but that's not how it translates in Postman. In Postman, it translates to this format. So you see, you have the attachment, you have the entity name, but instead of substituting the actual values or variables like you do in other requests, what you do is you actually prefix the parameter name with the colon and add it to the URL. So in this case, it's going to be colon record ID, which is this parameter, and then colon field name, this parameter. So if I take this and append it to my base URL, this will be the complete URL for this request. Now go back to Postman and add that request here. Now please note that there is nothing here except for query parameters. There's nothing here. So if I go back and put this in, you will see that the path variables that you have included in the URL translate to a tabulated list of path variables in Postman. Now this is where we are going to be passing in the values that we need. So the record ID has the value of the entity ID that you need to target. So in this case, I have already created a variable, and that is the DS entity ID. So I'll be using that variable. And then for the field name, I also have another variable that is populated with the internal name of the file type field in my data service. So in this case, I'll populate these two path variables with their corresponding variables. Okay, so we have now assigned the values that are required for this to be submitted as part of the URL. So we have now assembled the file upload request, and we are ready to send this request to the data service instance. Now, before I do that, I have to save this request. And the next thing that I have to do is refresh my token. So I'm going to go back to my script that actually refreshes the access token by using the current value of the refresh token. So I'm going to submit this request and get myself a token. Okay, we have success. So if you remember from the previous parts of this video series, The access token is automatically populated into this variable because of this test that we wrote for this script. So now I have my latest access token. Now we are ready to submit this request. So I'm going to clear the console and hit send. I have success and the record has been returned successfully. Now, if I go back to the data service instance and go into data, there isn't anything against this target entity record. So I'm going to hit refresh. And there we have the file. So here we can either download the file or remove the file or change this file if we want to. So this is how we submit a request in Postman. I'd also mentioned earlier that we are not going to be setting this content type explicitly like we do in other requests. And I'll show you now why that is. The first reason is that Postman is able to recognize what kind of a content you have submitted in the request and set the header accordingly. That's one reason. And the second reason is there is additional information that actually gets appended to this header based on the path type or the path variables that you set in your request. So if we go back to Postman and now look at the headers, you will see the content type header set here. It not only contains the multi-part form data signature, but it also contains additional information of the content boundary. And this part of the header type is composed by Postman based on all the inputs that you have given to this request. So if I go down to the raw request and drill down to the headers, you can see how that content type is actually composed when the request is sent over the wire. And this is the reason why you do not want to be setting that header yourself. So this is how you actually upload a file to an entity record using Postman. So let us switch over to Talend and take a look at how this request is composed. Now for Talend, what I'm going to be doing is I will be targeting a different record. In this case, I'm going to be uploading a file against this record, Jane Doe. So I'm going to pick up this entity ID. And what I'll do now is I'll compose the extension URL that's going to have that entity ID. And of course, this is not going to change. So what happens now is my URL is going to change to. So this is a much more straightforward URL when it comes to comparing with the style of the URL that you composed with Postman. So now I have this URL and I'm going to copy this. So what I've done here in Talend is I have created a project, a similar project. And what I'll be doing is composing a new request under this project. So I'm going to hit open request. Of course, I'll set this to post. And then I'm going to paste the URL. Observe that this URL has got straightforward values of the entity ID and the field, the file type field. Next, the content type, of course, is going to be set to multi-part form data. And the next item on the list based on our documentation If I go back to our documentation, is going to be authorization. So what I'll be doing is I don't have a mechanism to store tokens in Talend. So I'm going to borrow the token from Postman. So this is the latest token that we got from Postman, and it has been less than an hour. So I'm going to copy the whole thing, and I'm going to go back to Talend, and I'm going to paste that here. Remember, when you compose a request with the Talend, you have to have the bearer specifically typed along with your token. Postman puts that in there automatically, but you have to type that in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in authorization. That is good. So we have our content type, we have our authorization, we have the request, a URL, and if we want, we can add a query parameter, and that is the expansion level. So that's good. So based on our documentation, we have authorization, content type, we have the expansion level, and of course, this is part of the URL. The next item on the list will be the body, and we know that the content type is going to be form data, so we select form, and we add a form parameter, and we set this to type file, and we set it to name file, and then we choose the file. In this case, I'm going to choose this image, Jane Doe, say open. So you can see that this form of setting a request in Talend aligns pretty straightforward with the documentation. So now let's submit this request and see whether our file upload is going to be successful. And we have success. So we have the message 200 and a successful response. So if I go back to the data service, so Jane Doe, there's no file right now. Refresh, there it is. And that's how we use the upload file to entity endpoint to submit files to the entity record in the data service instance. And we also covered a couple of approaches, one through Postman and the other through Talend. So I hope that you'll find this helpful based on what type of client that you're using to submit this request. Okay, so we are going to be moving on to the download file from entity endpoint. In this case, what we'll be doing is we're going to be targeting one of these two entities that have files associated with them. And then we are going to be downloading the file for that entity via the API request. So coming back to the documentation, as usual, we start with the base URL that translates to this format. And unlike the file upload request that you saw, the extension URL is going to be a lot more straightforward this time and a lot more simpler. Again, if you see the general form of the extension URL from the documentation, it translates to attachment, the entity name, and we are going to be using the variable from Postman that contains the target entity ID and also the name of the internal name of the file type field in the data service entity. So if I put these two together, this is my full URL for the download file endpoint. So I'm going to go back to Postman and I have a new request. So I'm going to put it in here. And please note that the request type is GET. The authorization header, as usual, will be the bearer token, and I have the variable populated. In terms of the request headers for this request, there's only the authorization header, nothing else. And then, of course, the path variables, as you saw, they are part of the URL. And that's pretty much it for composing this request to download a file, which is a lot simpler and a lot easier. The next thing that we are going to be doing is deciding which entity that we are going to target. So what I have decided to do is target this entity and download the file jane.do via the API request. So what I've done is I've copied this ID and updated the entity ID variable in Postman. And you can see that this entity ID has been updated. So we know which entity we are targeting. And I'm going to save this request next. I'm ready to send this request now, but just in case, I'm going to get a new token. Clear the console. And I'm going to now submit the request to download the file. And we have success. And if you look at the raw response, it's a file. So in Postman, what we do is we click on the save response under the response window, and we do file save to a file. And in this case, I'm going to just say jane.do downloaded from data service. And I'm going to give it an extension, PNG, and hit save. So now if I go back and look at the response, and here is the file that we just uploaded. We have now downloaded that file via the download file API endpoint. Finally, we'll take a look at the last endpoint for the file operations, and that is the delete file from entity endpoint. And this is a delete operation. From the documentation and what you saw earlier, you can see that the base URL and the extension URL is going to pretty much translate to exactly the file download request that we placed a few minutes ago. So what I'll be doing now is going to create a new request. And this request is going to be delete. The URL is identical. So I'm going to copy this from the previous request and paste it here. And if we go back to the documentation, there is only one header. That's the authorization. So we go back and we set the authorization. Good. There is no body. It's none. And all we have to do now is to save this request and submit it. So I'm going to save it now. So once I submit this request, what's going to happen is this entity that we have is going to lose this file. So this file is going to be deleted against this target entity. So I'm going to go back and hit send. And we have success. And if we go back to the automation cloud, that is the file here, and when I refresh, the file's gone. So that's pretty much it for this video. We covered all the three different types of file-based operations for entities using the UiPath Data Service API endpoints. In the next video, we'll take a look at the query entity endpoint, and we'll also take a look at how to use the open API access specification to create a project in Postman. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.